Hi, I'm Victoria Chandler. I'm the Arkansas Made researcher at Historic Arkansas Museum. And today I've got with me Jennifer Carman, one of the authors of the new Arkansas Made books. And so we're going to kind of dig in. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for being here.
Hi, Victoria. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is so thrilling. You and I have both been working on these for quite a while. And so it's very exciting to finally have everybody else see them as well.
It has come to fruition and it is a thrill.
Yeah. Yeah. So, do you mind telling us a bit about your background and how you first got started with Arkansas Made?
Sure. So I have a kind of strange background in studio art and art history and connoisseurship. And for 18 years now, I've worked here in Little Rock as an independent art advisor and appraiser. And I met Swanee Bennett and Bill Worthen about 16 years ago at a time when I was still just figuring out how I was going to put my master's degree and my connoisseurship training from Christie's into some effective way of being employed. And at the time, Historic Arkansas Museum had a small team of researchers, and Swanee and Bill were, of course, interested in trying to identify and document artists and artisans who had worked in Arkansas. And they were doing that by reading microfiche, looking at census data, combing through records, 19th century newspapers, trying to identify various tradesmen and makers who might have labeled themselves as a cabinet maker or a marble cutter or a sign painter, or people who advertised their services in those papers. Because in the 19th century, especially in places like Arkansas, most artists and makers certainly didn't conceive of themselves as a kind of highbrow or creative visionary as we might think of fine artists today.
Yeah.
They were more sort of tradesmen who might have painted portraits and commercial signs or carriages. And I spent a lot of time back in those early years kind of reading microfilm, and I developed an obsession. I guess Swanee and Bill got to me, and over time, I came to realize that their interests and mine dovetailed quite nicely, because while they were trying to document and record all these artists, I was a person who, in my role as an art advisor, was going into houses and collections all over the state. And I was learning about artists that I hadn't heard of and that the museum hadn't yet documented. And, sometimes it would be somebody showing me something that they wanted me to appraise. Often it was a thing I just saw,
Yeah.
on their wall. And
Yeah.
if you ask me to a dinner party, I'm going to start snooping around your house, asking lots of questions.
Yeah.
So it kind of went that way. And probably by 2010, I shared their devotion and obsession to the project and started keeping meticulous records of every artist I came across and tried to follow up with what I could find out about them.
Yeah. No, it's really quick to get obsessed with Arkansas Made, especially it's the hunt of, finding these artists and tracking them down. And even, on the microfilm machines, you can get quickly lost in looking for names and records.
It is true.
Yeah.
It is true.
Well, so that, yeah, you kind of started with that. And then I guess I think Bill and Swanee wanted to expand the books as soon as the other ones were published. But what was kind of like the impetus for expanding the original volumes? Because I know the fine art chapter was particularly one of the main motivators.
Well, so the two original volumes were published back in 1991, and they featured research and writing of Swanee and Bill and work by researchers working then. And they chronicled fine and decorative arts made in Arkansas between 1819 and 1870. So, it was essentially focused on the territorial era and the first few decades of statehood. And those books, they were and are a terrific achievement, but they obviously have a significant limitation in that their cutoff date for the research was 1870, which was, of course, 150 years ago. So a century and a half of artistic activity, it just isn't included. And the new volumes expand that body of research up through 1950. So there's 80 more years. And, just as a side note to this, I think you've invited me to it's Women's History Month.
Yes.
In addition to all these additional decades of documentation, I think it's important to acknowledge here that the first volumes were, by and large, presenting objects made predominantly by white males.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope these new volumes have moved that needle a little bit.
Yes.
And also there are new chapters featuring Native American objects and vernacular architecture. So the new books also bring to light new subject areas.
Yes. No, it's really exciting. And I think along that line, some of the new artists, I think that perhaps we've known about for a while, those were the real impetuses because they're these major players in not just Arkansas art history and decorative art history, but worldwide. And their huge significance that we, it hasn't really been discussed elsewhere. How many new artists did you add to the new volumes? Because I know that I don't actually know the count of the original fine art in volumes, but I know it was not as large as it is now. Yeah.
Well, you are going to be stunned. I actually do know how many artists in the first one. So the first volumes from the 90s, I can't speak for obviously the whole books because I haven't counted and I'm not as intimately aware, but the fine art chapter had 38 artists.
Oh my gosh.
And I knew you would say that. And 3 of them were women. So three of the 38 were women. And I don't have an exact number on how many artists are in the new book. I should know that, but it's hazy.
Yeah.
But what I do know is that there are still embarrassingly too few.
Yes.
But that this expanded version certainly has more women and more people of color included. And I think when it went to press, it had about 1,000 more artists.
Mm-hmm.
And probably by this point today, my research is probably up to maybe 80 more beyond that.
Yes.
So it's pretty amazing. I think we have a lot to be proud of.
Yes.
Obviously, this, the thing that keeps me up at night is knowing that I've missed so many artists that are still waiting to be found.
Oh, yeah.
And there also are many artists that I did research and that just didn't make the manuscript deadline. For instance, I researched each and every Japanese American whose name was known to me that created art at Camp Rower or Camp Jerome during World War II. And they just didn't make the cutoff. And that was too bad. And to be clear, I alone did not find all of these artists. This was the work of many researchers over many years. I'm just honored to have contributed and have been entrusted with helping with the project.
Yeah, I think that's something to that many people don't know about, but Arkansas Made, it's not just us alone. We are taking the research from many colleagues throughout the decades, really. And what's unique about this project is that we've just collated all the data. And so while some people have researched particular artists or groups like the Butler Turner and the internment camps, we're just gathering it all together and identifying as these Arkansas Made items, which is really exciting. And I think so. I got advice from a colleague who works at the Yale Museum, but it was kind of comforting and kind of not and terrifying, but she talked about how as soon as you send the books, your manuscript off to the publishers, it's already out of print, it's already out of date. And that's very true here. We sent these off almost 2 years ago, the first round, and there's just so many more we've discovered, so many works of art and wonderful artists that we wish we could have included, but
absolutely
weren't able to. Yeah, it's really a disappointment. We've got so much more, and we can't.
It is. That'll be the impetus for next time, though. Right?
I know. Yeah, that's more to come. Yeah. So, and since it is kind of back to Women's History Month, can you kind of tell us about some of the most important female artists from Arkansas? Here?
Sure. I thought about this week, and I decided I would feature one 19th century artist and one 20th century artist, because there are many, many incredible women artists from Arkansas, but in the scope of this time period. There's just, they're so amazing. I could spend an hour on each of them.
Yeah.
But in my mind, without doubt, the two most influential women artists from the state are Jenny Deloney and Elsie Friend. These women both really made their mark on our state. And I'll try to give you a kind of a brief synopsis of each. Jenny Deloney was Arkansas's first woman to rise to international prominence as a painter.
Yes.
And she was born right after the Civil War and was raised in Hempstead County, which is where historic Washington State Park is. She was highly educated. She studied in Virginia at Wesleyan. She went to art school in Cincinnati and St. Louis. And by the time she was in her mid-20s, she was training at many of the most elite academies and ateliers in Paris. And in 1896, she actually studied alongside male artists, the first year that women were allowed to do so in Paris. And, you know, another kind of rare exception for a woman in that era, she was able to study anatomy from human cadavers while she was in France. And that was certainly a thing that women didn't typically do.
Yes.
And after these adventures in Paris, she came back to the States and she studied for a bit at some point with famed American Impressionist William Merritt Chase at Shinnecock Hills, Long Island. And she did, though, spend quite a bit of time off and on in her life having various studios here and there. And one of her, I think, more interesting studios that we know the most about is that she operated her own art school that she called the Southern Art School. And it was located just downtown, not far from Historic Arkansas Museum, really, on the third floor of the Masonic Temple that's on Scott Street.
Yes.
And she and her younger sister Daisy rented a few rooms there, and they advertised the school and their own wares. They taught painting, decorative design, drawing, and they even had live models that students could work from. She advertised herself as a portraitist, and she created miniature portraits, large-scale oil on canvas portraits, and also painted china, you know, decorative vases and whatnot.
Yes.
And by the way, as far as I can tell, none of those, I mean, I'm sure they survive, but I'm not aware of any of her miniatures that have been identified. And it's something I look for every time I'm in a house. I kind of ask them, do you have any miniatures? You know, especially if they live downtown. And I have a few feelers out there waiting to see, but who knows?
Yes.
So,
same with the China painting. I always, you know, sometimes there's just an initial or something, but you know, that's such a fool's gold to try to find. I think
it would be so cool. I know it, you know, it's out there, and I know it's out there. So maybe by the next volume we will locate it.
We'll locate it.
We can hope. She let's see. She exhibited her work quite widely in cities as near to us as New Orleans or Chicago or Atlanta, and as far away as Berlin. And in 1897, when she was 31 and wasn't too far removed from her time in Paris, she actually became the first director of art at the Arkansas Industrial University in Fayetteville, which by the end of her 4 years there had become what we know as the University of Arkansas. And she essentially established that art department, and it became the first collegiate art program in the state. And, you know, even though she wasn't there very long and she was quite young while she was there, she certainly left her mark. And, you know, she bounced between Little Rock and New York for a time, kind of toward the end of her life. And she continued doing portrait commissions, although not as often as she had in the late 19th and early 20th century. But what I love so much about her is that not only is she, you know, a consummate master of her craft, but she really opened the door for many students in Arkansas to pursue the study of art And I think that really shaped the culture of social engagement that, that the state saw into the 20th century.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good synopsis of Jenny.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, I feel like she's really was one of the first kind of major artists who hadn't gotten their due in a major publication. And she's the reason we have art education in the state, and is the first teacher there. It's just really important.
It's really, it's great.
Yeah, but there's so many others like yes, like Elsie and others.
Yes, I will tell you about Elsie. So she too, like Jenny Deloney, I think really transformed the cultural landscape here. She was born in Missouri and grew up on a game preserve. And her family said that she always knew she wanted to be an artist. And she did go to 1 year of school at the Kansas City Art Institute, but I think some of the economic pressures of the period prevented her from continuing that. Yeah. And so after her year in Kansas City, she actually went to Branson, Missouri, and she spent a period of time selling, I guess, what sound like little souvenir jewelry made of walnut shells. And fishermen there would hire her to take their catch and make these plaster casts that she would paint of their fish. And while she was doing all of that, she met a young artist named Louis Friend, who was touring the Ozarks in his Model T, painting vernacular homes and shops that were falling into decay. And within a handful of years, they eventually married and moved into Hatchet Hall in Eureka Springs, which was a home once owned by temperance advocate Carrie Nation. And they operated a summer school there for, I don't know, a dozen years. It was quite a while, called the Art School of the Ozarks. And during their time there, Louis taught painting and drawing, and Elsie taught a variety of crafts like weaving and fabric design. And she really worked on honing her skills, and she proved to be a very versatile artist because she was willing to try her hand at everything.
Yes.
She trained with a Native American weaver. She painted in oils and watercolors and pen and ink, and she was a printmaker, and she made terrific etchings and woodcuts and linocuts, and she became fairly enamored with ceramics. And while working with ceramics, she developed this innovative process whereby she fused little bits of glass to clay and then fired them together in a kiln. I'll show you, I don't know if you can see this.
Yes.
But here is an example of one of these. So you can see the back is clay, and she would get clay. She wanted to use native materials. So this clay is from a cave in Beaver, Arkansas, is where she allegedly got her clay. And then you can see the top layer that's really kind of lustrous and glossy and pleasing. These are just little bits of glass that have been fused to it. And obviously this is quite compelling. And I think she thought of this as a stone, kind of like a precious, like you think of a precious stone, but it was slightly less precious in a way because it was made of these humble materials.
Yes.
And what I think is really interesting about her work is that she suspended these sparkling fused glass stones amid these curving strands of copper or silver to form jewelry that was quite unique in its time. She really was a Renaissance woman. Collectors certainly today adore all of her work, but I think it's her studio jewelry that particularly stands out because she largely worked in isolation, but managed to anticipate trends that emerged a little bit later than when she started making these pieces, which is the trend of studio jewelers by mid-century ditching precious stones for more modest materials. And I'm sure some people listening know Alan Du Bois, who was the former curator of decorative arts at the Art Center. And he called her in an exhibition catalog from many decades ago a modern pioneer.
Yes.
And I think that that's really a great summation of her.
Mm-hmm.
Because even though she, in a way, worked in the shadow of her husband's success, like too many women married
Mm-hmm.
to male artists, I think her legacy has really been coming into its own for many years.
Yes.
She had a terrific sensibility, a great eye for crafting pleasing forms, no matter the medium. And I really credit her with creating part of the culture that enabled women artists to expand their opportunities to study art, exhibit art, and develop a sense of artistic community.
Oh, definitely. In her work, I think another part of her legacy, tying back to Jenny Deloney, is that her and Lewis, her husband, really created another wave of art studies in the state, and are responsible for so many creative minds that are working today still. And it were just huge. They were just such great teachers, and thankfully, Elsie was adept in many fields, and so was able to teach in a multitude of ways. And I love how her work, she's kind of part of that movement that bringing handicrafts or traditional methods kind of into more sophisticated and viewed as actual art instead of just something practiced by women or something to do at the home, which is really wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And what I love about both Jenny Deloney and Elsie Friend is that they both have ties to some of our major colleges and universities. Obviously
Yes.
Jenny Deloney at the University of Arkansas, and both Lewis and Elsie Friend were very engaged in the formation and early years of the art department at Hendrix College, which you just gave a great talk on that a couple weeks ago. So
yes.
I think these two women sort of, that they pursued their own careers while also fostering and kind of cultivating education in the arts, which has made it what it is today.
Yeah, definitely. We owe them a lot. Well, great. And then is there another artist you wanted to mention? Or is perhaps the most interesting artist you've discovered?
Yeah, you asked me who are the most interesting artists I discovered, and the funny thing is I didn't have to think about it more than 1 second.
Yes.
Because I knew exactly who it was going to be. So, and I cannot take credit for discovering her, but I know without a doubt who's the most interesting, and it's pretty wacky.
Yes.
I'll just say that the Philadelphia and Chicago World's Fairs had quite a sensation. They were really taken by storm by a woman from Arkansas named Caroline Shock Brooks.
Yes.
And she eventually grew to great international celebration for her sculptures that were, at the time, she made things in wax and clay and marble. But what really caught the imagination of the world were her magnificent works carved from butter.
Yes.
And this is the most classic, terrific Arkansas story you can imagine.
Yes. It's like it's such a good representation of art.
You couldn't make this up if you tried.
Oh yeah.
In fact, I revisited the details last week in anticipation of this talk, and it cracked me up all over again. So in 1867, so she's 27 at this time, and she's a wife. Her husband's cotton crop failed, and they were in a bit of a financial pickle. And like any resourceful housewife, she decided that she was going to come to the rescue by coming up with some supplemental income by carving butter. And to put this in context, in the 19th century, sculpted or carved or molded butter wasn't that out of the ordinary. A great table setting might have a fairly interesting bit of butter that had been molded or that was decorative or whatnot. So it wasn't completely as insane as it might sound today. But I think it's fair to say she took this to a level that had not quite been considered.
Yes.
And so she used, according to records I found, butter paddles, sticks, broom straws, and camel hair pencils to create these bas relief sculptures that she kept on ice. And she showed these in galleries in cities around the country. An art gallery, and the New York Times went nuts over an exhibition of her work at an art gallery in Cincinnati. She made a lifelike Lady Godiva, a Christopher Columbus, Charles Dickens characters. And in 1873, when she was 33, so she'd been carving the butter for 5 years at that point, she carved a work at her kitchen table in Helena that traveled 2,000 miles to the 1876 Centennial Exhibition in Philly, where the critics declared it, quote, the most unique and beautiful exhibit in the Centennial.
Yes.
And she actually became so famous. This is a detail I had forgotten. She became so famous that she had studios in Washington, D.C. and New York with commissions of sculptures and a variety of materials because of this fame she had gathered with her butter sculptures. And my favorite sort of anecdote about her is that in the late 1870s, she was traveling to Paris with a giant life-size sculpture. And when she entered the country, the customs officials refused to sign off or declare her work as a sculpture or as art. And they wrote on the customs form that it was 110 pounds of butter, which tells you the size of this thing, because
massive. 110 pounds.
That's no small
life size.
That's insane.
Yes, it's so funny. Her work is just so incredible. I think that's so unique. And a fact about the Centennial Exposition, not only was it the most exciting, but this is at a time when they had separate tents for the men and women. And so to be declared the most interesting overall, she caused quite an uproar, and people couldn't believe that she made her butter sculptures sometimes. So sometimes she would do demonstrations just to prove them wrong and show that she was a sculptress and an artist in her own right.
That's right. I think she was on a circuit for a while doing demos around the country. And
yes, yeah. And I think I love some clips about her from fellow women sculptors at the time. She's another pioneer in that a lot of female sculptors credit her for kind of like paving the way to be taken seriously as artists, because it was quite a male-dominated field, even until the mid-20th century. But yeah, really wonderful. On that note, what is your favorite Arkansas-made piece? Do you have that in mind?
Well, I could never choose just
one. You can.
After all these years, they all
feel child.
They feel very dear to me.
Yes.
I will say, normally when it's not Women's History Month, if I'm asked about what my favorite Arkansas-made objects are, certainly in the art arena, I always am drawn to artworks where the artist is sort of exercising their ability as kind of an artist as activist. And I feel like we see a lot more, obviously in the 19th century in Arkansas, that is not happening. But in the 20th century, you actually see, Ben Shahn and, you see, Joe Jones mural at the Commonwealth College. And I really am, and Louis Friend's, wartime works. I feel like those things really excite me, and they're my favorite things to ponder and think about. And I think it's just a thing I wish there were more of, frankly, in this book. Yeah. But since it's Women's History Month, I was thinking about favorites that are by artists that people perhaps have never heard of. Something that came to mind was Malvina McIninch's portrait of her children. And what I love, well, first of all, I love that, it's the pandemic right now, so we're all spending time at home. And what this feels like, she painted this in 1951, and I actually cheated and snuck it into the book because even though it was 1 year past the deadline, I just couldn't bear the thought of readers waiting 30 more years to see it. But what I love is that her children's faces are so earnest, and they're not that size and age forever. And she really captures this moment in their house that is just, who doesn't like the comfort of home and the connection with their mother or their children? And that's a thing that's been on my mind a lot this year. And I feel like that was a good one to kind of sneak in, because also it's about the latest thing in the book. There's one thing later, and I'm not going to tell anyone what it is. Cheated, but
yeah, no, I think this piece is just so, it really is kind of captures kind of the spirit of like idyllic home. And it's just so beautiful. The children are wonderful, and I love that there's like maybe a Kmart picture in that she's holding, and other little things.
Absolutely, it's like double Arkansas Maid.
Yeah, it's double. I know. Even more. Well, great. Well, I just one more question. So why do you think these new volumes are so important? Why should people go check them out?
Well, I think these new volumes are important for several reasons. First of all, I don't think it's impossible to understand or talk about a place without acknowledging and exploring the indigenous peoples that have been rooted there. The reality is that Arkansas has been home to countless Native peoples who were making astonishingly beautiful and functional and sophisticated objects long before white tradesmen hit the scene. So I'm glad that Anne Early's chapter celebrates some of those people and the objects they made.
Yeah.
I also think these volumes are important in highlighting some of the many contributions of women and people of color. I think that could be a very long talk for another day, an important one to have. And lastly, I think there's something really compelling about how the time period that this book encompasses really lays the foundation or framework for understanding the art world in Arkansas as we know it today, because that period witnessed the establishment of collegiate arts education with Jenny Deloney, and within 20 years of that, in Little Rock, the Fine Arts Club was founded, and that Fine Arts Club, by 1937, formed the core support to creating what was called the Museum of Fine Arts at the time, and that's many of us have known since 1961 as the Arkansas Arts Center. And that the push for that was largely a group of organized women who were very dedicated to this cause.
Yeah.
And obviously it's come full circle now, because they're now going to be called the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts.
Yeah, it's very appropriate.
And that's one more thing that is wrong in our book, because when it went to press, they didn't have that name. So there's
the name release came, I think, actually the week before the books were released to the public, so there's no time to update it. And I don't think they had decided on the new name yet when we first included these works.
I don't think so. It just goes to show, though, it's not by the time it goes to press, it just is what it is.
It is what it is, but it's so great to have these works in people's homes, and it's wonderful. I think one of the exciting things about, I've got my book, but like with the Arkansas Maid, this is volume 2. The fine art is just, it's just, you can look up these names, and perhaps you have something hanging on your wall at home that you didn't know before, that you just gotten somewhere or had been in your family. Same with the pieces of furniture and ceramics and quilts, and it's just a fun way to add more meaning to perhaps an already meaningful piece, and have more reason to celebrate it. But yeah, well, thank you so much. This is wonderful, and how perfect.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to do this. I hope everybody will, if not buy the book, find a copy and look at it, because what I love is that it really kind of, I think the 20th century of art in Arkansas really expands the idea of what artists can do and be. And that's what keeps me so motivated to carry forward with the research. And I know I'm not alone, because this is an obsession that many that we and many of our friends and colleagues share. And so if any artists are watching this,
Yes.
talk to me, talk to the museum, join the Arkansas Arts Council, make sure that people know about you.
Yeah.
Because I promise you, it's so much easier for you to tell us about yourself than for me to try to read all the papers and figure out who you are.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. That's actually another talk for another day. But we have an artist who's included in the books named Arlie Payne, and that is a mystery that we could not figure out for years and years and years, and we kept flip-flopping on the identity and even just who they were. So if artists can reach out, it's just wonderful to have your own words of what your art is. So yeah, well, great. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. And
Thank you
have a
so
great
much for
day.
inviting me, Victoria.
Yeah, thanks.
Bye.
Bye.